Welcome to the George Asks podcast, the podcast where George asks me questions and I give him convoluted answers. Welcome and enjoy. A conversation about leadership came up the other day, and something I tried to communicate to the person I was talking to was the way I view leadership, especially at the highest political levels, was this conversation. I believe that the best leaders are those with the ability, capacity, and competency to take independent action. And I thought about this even more and more, and I realized it traces back to my understanding of history and specifically how history is taught nowadays, and something that I think is very troublesome about that. So if you went to a history class in your high school, you were probably taught about the trends and forces theory of history. Sounds great, right? We all know there's a lot of things going on outside politics, outside of our control, outside of our nation, that are general trends. It could be scientific, it could be economic, it could be demographic, it could be all these other things. No one's denying that there are trends and forces acting upon us. However, I believe that studying history through that lens is simply inaccurate and not helpful. Now, why do I say that? Because trends and forces takes the agency out of the actors in history, and it takes agency out of the darkest and most tense moments of their lives. Now, there are plenty of times in history where people are a victim of circumstance, but there are also times in history where people are not. Now, how do I view these different situations? Is the fact is weak leaders have to go with the trends and forces. They are subject to whatever is happening around them and can't alter course. And this can be a big problem for states because one of the biggest issues for states, for example, one of the biggest benefits of being a democracy that alternates the highest positions every 4 years, or in the Senate during other years and things like that. Some of our positions don't have these limits, but the benefit of that is that you get a new government that can take a new direction every 4 years, especially in the executive branch, which is very important. But if you have a weak leader, so much is baked into the cake. So much is in the works with the bureaucracy. The way I viewed it is most presidents have a list of things that they can do and things that they're not allowed to do. What they're not allowed to do is not listed. They simply get a list of what they can do, and they can pick their priorities as such. If you go against this, there's a lot of ways the bureaucracy, the opposition and political parties, the Senate, the House legislatures, passing and overriding the executive branch. But in the modern era, it's really important because the legislature has given so much power to the executive branch that the executive branch cannot be there's no appropriate oversight, particularly when it comes to American foreign policy in the House and Senate. And so if you have a president, the head of the executive branch, who also doesn't know how to control this massive multi-million employee, I think it was 16 million in total that work contracting or directly for the federal government, about 2 to 4, depending on if you include military personnel employed directly. So the point being that weak leaders have to go with the trends and forces. This is why strong men, that motif, are often very appealing, is because they have the ability to go against the grain. You can think of many leaders, and they get branded a lot of different ways. So you could say Putin's like that, where he took a democratizing Russia and turned it back into an authoritarian czarist place. You could say Trump's like that because he is willing to do and say anything he feels and change his mind at any given moment, meaning that's why he's Teflon Trump. You can't pin him down and beat him on something. He'll simply adapt, change, reframe it, something like that. And there's other leaders throughout history that have done this. You think of how that's how Hitler took power. He was voted into power and given power by the traditional conservatives because he was able to go against what the Weimar Republic was doing. And the trend there was, we're democratizing, we're going to be subject to the Versailles Treaty, and he said no. And that's why when you look through history, even going back to like Alexander the Great, the trend at the time was the Persians controlled everything. They did it very well. They had done it for hundreds of years, and there was no sign that they were going to collapse in that way until Alexander came along and beat them over and over and over and over. And it's hard to say that how much that changed that world. An army of 30 to 60,000 men didn't have agency in these things. So I go back to my point that a strong leader is one who can change his mind. I have issues with that with Biden, where look at his Israel policy. It's not clear that even if he supports Israel and thinks it, then decides they've gone too far and changes his mind or wants to pull back, he's not going to do anything, one, in a competent way, but also in an effective way. I believe American foreign policy is hardline behind Israel. I think we have a lot of, de facto and de jure agreements that keep us there and keep us on their side. So I think people should keep this in mind with the upcoming election of a government that can't act against the trends and forces is going to be is subject to happenstance, essentially. And that's something that just can't be done for any organizations. It's why organizations generally corrupt over time, is one of those reasons, is that the necessary changes aren't always possible given the trend and the structure and everything else. So I'd have us rethink this whole trends and forces idea, because I believe it's kind of a liberal idea, not necessarily a modern liberal, but it cropped up in the 20th century, late 20th century, the last 50 years of that. And I think it's been detrimental because it simply just points out an obvious thing, that these men are not acting in a vacuum. No one says when they mean great man history that it was the man who did it all. In Germany, Hitler did not murder everyone himself. There were millions of other Germans doing it. Under Stalin, there's millions of people running and managing the gulags and getting wealthy off of it. So when we attribute some of these characteristics to certain leaders, it doesn't necessarily mean follow them. A strong leader is not always the right person for the job and at the time. This is something you often learn with generalship, is that it's much more the right man at the right time with the right skill set. For instance, General Grant was often a great general in the Civil War, but it was often referenced that he had a lot of business failures early in his life. In his 20s and 30s, where he upstarted these businesses, would go bankrupt, try something else, go bankrupt. But when he was a general, that was one of the things he was the very best at, was managing the supply lines, managing the movement of the troops, which was huge, of let's get the troops to the place and we'll have everything we need at the same time. He becomes a managerial type of general, as opposed to Stonewall Jackson, who charges in with his troops and meets his end by being too far ahead of the riflemen and getting shot, I think 7 to 9 times over his body. But he's the run in and attack them kind of general. There was a French general like that, Maurice Gamelin, in World War One. Yeah, it might not be him, but it was. There's a butcher. There's many butchers on the French side. Brave men led by donkeys is the saying. So when you think about weak and strong leaders, it's very important because, for example, if you go to Ukraine and look at the situation, I can't help but think that Zelensky, who is praised as a very strong, impeccable leader by the West, that he's actually a weak leader, because he does not have any ability to zig or zag in his strategic calculation. He's locked into one path, and his one path is rapidly making him irrelevant, because Ukraine doesn't have a functioning economy. They don't have those peacetime things that they can use to both get their exports out to give them hard currency, like the agricultural stuff, and also the factories to make their own munitions, which wasn't very good in the first place. So they've mortgaged their country to the West in an effort to keep their freedom. The problem is I'm not sure if Zelensky's the man to lead them to freedom, or if he's just recruiter in chief, giving the West what it wants, grinding his country down until something. It's not clear that Zelensky could ever make an agreement with Russia. If he doesn't, that can be a strategic choice, not to have an armistice and not acknowledge their acquisitions. But the idea that he's a strong leader, it's not clear. Squeeze